Welcome to another exciting podcast of Royal Oak Victory Church. We're glad you've joined us. We are a community devoted to God, connected to others, and influencing our world.
Well, I want to tell you a little bit about the summer of 2008. That's 11 years ago for those of you that are counting. And two things happened that summer that were very instrumental in my life, very eye-opening in my life. And one of them was the fact that I got engaged to my beautiful wife that summer, which was a big deal for me. And we ended up getting married later that year. So the summer of 2008 will always hold that place in my heart as we began our journey together. But the other thing that happened in the summer of 2008 is that there was this movie that came out that kind of changed the course of the way we watch movies over the last decade. I think many of us have been there on this journey together over this last 11 years. Even if you don't want to admit it, you've probably seen one of these movies. And the movie I'm talking about that came out in 2008 was the one called Iron Man. Has anybody seen Iron Man? See, a lot of hands going up. I can't believe it's 11 years ago already, but anyways. This movie started a journey for many of us. It has spanned 22 different films over the last 11 years. Something we call the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It's kind of crazy. Those of us that have been involved, I must admit, is a bit of a guilty pleasure for me. I enjoy seeing these movies. But it all ended kind of this summer, at least this piece of the puzzle ended this summer with a movie called Avengers Endgame. That many of us have seen. Of course, over these years, we've seen many of these kind of interesting and beloved cartoon and comic characters come to life on the screen. Thor and Hulk, Captain America, all of these. And it's crazy to think that over these last 10 years, over these 22 films, that Marvel has earned over $20 billion on these movies. That's no small sum. And this last movie, the one that just kind of culminated, as I said, Avengers Endgame, that movie alone, which just left theaters, earned over $2.7 billion by itself. Anybody can understand those numbers. Those are big numbers. It made it the second biggest movie, second highest grossing movie of all time. Now, what captivated those of us that have seen these movies, maybe some of them or all of them, is that each director has been given the ability to have a unique perspective, a unique take. Like I said, there's a bit of that childhood fun involved. These are comic books that we read as kids, and there's this unique trait that they installed where you have to stay to the very bitter end to see this 30-second clip at the end of the movie. So you got to sit through 5 minutes of scrolling names just to see this 30-second clip because it ties into the next movie. And it's just, all of these stories are so intricately intertwined that even though they stand alone, they're also all connected. And it's just kind of been fascinating to watch. How many here have seen at least one of these 22 movies? Right? I think it's probably fair to say that most of us, and maybe you're just like me, you've seen all 22 movies. Few less hands, but that's okay. Like I said, for me, Spider-Man's one of those things that I grew up on, and so this has been a lot of fun over the last 10 years, 11 years. Now, we don't quite know the long-term legacy of these movies yet. I mean, we know they've made a lot of money, but we don't know what they're going to really be like in 10 or 20 or 30 years' time with hindsight. But the one thing we do know is we'll probably never forget about it, simply because Disney, who owns Marvel, never lets us forget about this stuff because they slap the logo on everything imaginable, shirts and cups and everything like that. So we won't forget about this anytime soon, even if there is no legacy for these movies. But the interesting thing is we have a set of stories that are very similar to these last 22 films. They have stood the test of time, and even though they have not made as much money at the box office, they still have intriguing characters. They still have interconnected storylines, and some of the stories we have are just so audacious in what they share and what they show that they just kind of blow our mind if we take a moment to really look at them. And of course, what adds to this fact is that these stories that we know, and many of us know very well, are true. They're things that have actually happened. And so what we find is that each one of these stories, lived by real people and all this interconnectedness, they have this valuable insight for us. Some very important lessons that we can learn, something that we can marvel at. Sorry, I had to do it. These stories deserve to be looked at. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start a brand new summer sermon series today that's going to look at the book of John, specifically the stories of the miracles that exist in this book. This sermon series is called Marvel at the Miracles of Jesus. And we're going to look at the 7 miracles over the next 7 weeks that John outlines in his book. But before we look at the first of these 7, we need to take a moment and understand what John was doing here. I mean, we know that Jesus performed way more than 7 miracles. So why did John only include those 7? Even John himself says that Jesus did way more than what I'm telling, but he only talks about 7. And some of these miracles are only recorded in the book of John. Well, he tells us why he's doing this right at the end of the book. So if we look at John 20, verse 30 and 31, it says this: "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book." So he's admitting clearly there's more than these 7. He says, "But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." So in other words, John is specifically choosing these 7 miracles, or as he calls them, signs, as proof that Jesus is in fact the Son of God. His book has this incredible apologetic or evangelistic point of view because everything that he writes about has a meaning. Everything that he says and points to is specifically designed to show us that Jesus is who he said he was, and that this gift of salvation, of everlasting life, can be accepted, believed, and approved of because of what Jesus did. So John is pointing through these signs, through these miracles, to the very existence of Jesus. That he was fully man and fully God, and when he came to give us freedom, that there can be no doubt in his mind, or really in our minds once we read this book and see these miracles, that Jesus is who he says he was. As one writer put it, signs are not merely miracles, they are miracles that have meaning. They are intended to convey truth that would not otherwise be known. And so what we're going to do over the course of the summer is look for the meaning in these miracles to find out what these signs mean. And it is important that we take into account this ultimate purpose, that each sign really is meant to point to Jesus so that we can accept it and believe it. Now, for those of us that have already accepted Jesus into our life, I want you to not just brush over this. As even I have done over the last few weeks, I've started to reread these miracles with a new insight, with a new vision, going, well, let's see what he wants to say, knowing that he sees these as more than just miracles, but as signs. I want us to take a fresh perspective, to look for that deeper and more profound meaning in each of these. And for those of you that have not yet entered into a relationship with Jesus Christ, I would ask you to look at these the way that John intended. That every miracle, every sign that he writes about is publicly provable evidence of Jesus' claims. And so with that in mind, I want all of us to look at the first miracle this morning. So join me, turn in your Bibles to John chapter 2. John chapter 2. I'm going to be reading out of the English Standard Version this morning. If you have a Bible version, you can flip to that. Now, John was written by one of Jesus' closest disciples, one of his dearest friends. He also directly observed everything that he's writing about. So we have this first-hand account. This isn't a second or third hand. This is direct evidence. And really what we're looking at here is this transition from the Old Testament to the New Testament that begins with Jesus' life and his ministry and then into the early church. So John's right there at the beginning talking about this transition. So John chapter 2, starting in verse 1. It says, "On the third day there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. And when the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, 'They have no wine.' And Jesus said to her, 'Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come.' His mother said to the servants, 'Do whatever he tells you.' Now there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, 'Fill the jars with water,' and they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, 'Now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast.' So they took it. Now when the master of the feast tasted the water, now become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, 'Everyone serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now.' This, the first of his signs, Jesus did at Cana in Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him." Now, for me as a pastor, one of the greatest joys in life, one of the greatest privileges I have in life is the ability to participate in weddings. It's just one of the things that I love to do, and it's the fun, the festivities, the joy of the day, the romance. It's a really neat thing to be a part of. Now, if you've been to enough weddings, whether it's as a guest or as a participant, you will know that weddings never go perfectly, right? There's always some snag, some hiccup that goes on that kind of puts a little bit of a kink or a quirk into the day. And we often laugh at it in hindsight, but in the moment, we're like, for a lot of people, it becomes a pretty big deal, right? Sometimes it's a minor issue, sometimes it's quite the catastrophe. Sometimes it's humorous or embarrassing, but weddings never go according to plan. How many know what I'm talking about? Right? We've all been part of those, right? I remember one wedding that Mary and I went to a number of years ago, and it was set in this picturesque turn-of-the-century church, just like out of Hollywood. You have the stained glass windows and the grand ceilings and the aisles and aisles of wooden pews. Now, everyone knows that weddings never start on time, right? They're always late. In fact, as much as my wife and I tried to have our wedding start on time, it didn't, but it wasn't because of us. It's because the guests kept arriving late. So we had to wait till everybody got there. But when we were at this wedding, it wasn't really a surprise that the wedding started late. We didn't really think anything of it. But then 10 minutes turned into 20, and 20 into 40, and we're sitting in this church going, what is happening here? Like, this should have started already, and right away you begin to think maybe the worst. Maybe this wedding isn't going to happen, right? Maybe one of them has run out or something, but we were told, no, this wedding is going to happen. We just need some more time, but they didn't tell us exactly what was going on. Well, an hour later, the wedding starts, and we found out afterwards that it was a dress issue that had caused the problem, and they had to get the dress basically sewn back together. It had ripped or something along those lines. But the only thing that I remember about that wedding is the wait. Because after an hour of sitting on hard wooden pews, they basically felt like you were sitting on concrete. So the best moment of the entire wedding for me is when the bride began to walk down the aisle, because I got to stand up. I didn't have to sit anymore on these pews. Now, in our passage today, John relates a story that's very familiar to us. It's a wedding that has a bit of a hiccup. And weddings were extremely important in Jewish society, so we shouldn't be surprised that we see Jesus partaking in one of them. It was a great social event. It would bring the entire community together. But more than that, it was valued for its religious significance. It wasn't just that the husband and wife were two becoming one, but really the reason marriage was instituted was it showed the relationship between mankind and God in this covenant relationship. So they took it very seriously. In a small community like Cana, it would have been a small farming community, everyone would have been involved. Everyone would have known one another. Being that they had a central town and the farms would surround, everybody would work together to help each other out, to plant and to sow and to reap the crop. They would have celebrated together the birth of children. They would have mourned together the loss of loved ones. I mean, I grew up in a small town, and still to this day, I can walk down the aisle of a store or down the street in downtown, and I can still have people yell my name, and maybe we haven't seen each other in 10 years, but you just kind of pick up where you left off because everybody knew everybody. And so this, to me, sounds pretty understandable, pretty knowledgeable, and anybody that's lived in a small town can relate to that. Now, knowing that Cana was in Galilee, we also know that Cana would have been very close to the town of Nazareth. So Nazareth is where Jesus and his mother Mary and his brothers would have lived. It's where they grew up. Because of that, we see that here they have been invited to this wedding. Mary has a role at the wedding, and Jesus and his disciples have been invited. We have to understand, remember, Jesus hasn't entered into ministry yet. He's not this super popular person that's attracting thousands and thousands of people by his teaching. He's not walking through and people are yelling his name because they know of the miracles he performed. Jesus really is anonymous at this point in time. We see even just from the previous chapter in John 1 that he has just started to recruit his disciples. He's barely started this process. People don't know who he is. He's just the son of a carpenter, so he's at this wedding as a guest, as someone who would have known the family. Now, weddings were also significant because it was the end of the betrothal period. Now, betrothal for us is a bit of a different concept. It's similar to how a boyfriend and a girlfriend will get engaged, but a betrothal is where they were actually legally bound together in marriage. They just weren't married. And what it allowed for was then the future husband to take a period of time knowing that he's got this future wife to prepare for, and he would take up to a year to get everything ready. He would build a house. He would make sure all of the details of the wedding were ready. He would have all the supplies. Basically, the groom did everything to do with the wedding, completely opposite of what we have now, right? Where the brides do everything and they have every intricate detail figured out. Back then, it was the groom. They did everything. And they would take up to a year to pull all of this together. And that would culminate in this wedding feast, this celebration that could take anywhere between 4 and 7 days of partying. And it was all of the community coming together to celebrate this new couple. No detail would have been overlooked because it was not just a religious ceremony. It was not just an important celebration for the town to gather together. This wedding would demonstrate to the community that this man was ready to be married, that he had the ability to provide for his future family, especially to his future in-laws, right? He's taking a year to prove to his future in-laws that he's the right guy, right? So there's a lot of pressure and stress on this guy. Right? It cannot be overstated how big of a deal weddings were. And so this week-long celebration is what John is telling us about. The year of betrothal is up. They're in the middle of this party. They're having a great time. They're getting close to being fully married. And Mary comes to Jesus and states it very plainly, they have no wine. Now, at first glance, this may not seem like much of a problem. This is more of a minor inconvenience, kind of the typical hiccup we would expect in a wedding. But this is a serious problem. First off, wine was a symbol of God's blessing. Wine had to be included in the ceremony because they knew what it represented. Throughout Psalms and Proverbs and Isaiah, we see over and over again the use of the metaphor of wine being more about God's provision and God's presence in the midst of Israel. So it was very important that they had wine just from the symbolic nature of saying God is in this place. If there's wine, God is here. Right? Sounds funny, but that's really what we're talking about. Now, from a practical perspective, wine was also used to purify the water. Because water was not clean, you draw it from the well, it's not clean like we would have it today. They would dilute the wine and the water together, and the fermented wine would actually cleanse the water. And so when you run out of wine, you don't just run out of wine, it means you also run out of water. So now you're at a wedding ceremony, and Mary coming and saying, there is no wine, is basically saying there is nothing to drink. And we're in the middle of this party, and we've run out of beverages. Right? This shortfall would have also signified to the entire community the underlying message that the groom wasn't ready, that he was not fit to be a husband, because he hadn't prepared accordingly. Running out of wine was a major catastrophe. It would have been incredibly embarrassing for the groom, and it would have been considered extremely rude to the guests, which of course are your friends and family. So Mary goes to Jesus looking for a solution. Now, did she know that he was going to perform a miracle? Maybe. But we have no proof of that. This is the first miracle, so it's not like she had a track record going, Jesus has done this and this and this and this. He'll do another one. No, he's never done a miracle before. So we don't really have any proof that that's why Jesus or Mary went to Jesus. More likely what occurred is the fact that Mary went to her eldest son, the one that was taking care of her and providing for her, because we have no evidence that Joseph is around by this point in time. So him, as the oldest son, would have taken care of his mother, the widow. And really, she's going to him, who's been her provider, saying, I need your help. Do something. She may not have known how he was going to do it, but she was going to her son and asking for help. Now, on an aside, how often do we do the same thing? That where we get to the point where we're running and we're running and we're running and we hit empty and then we go to Jesus. We're tired and we need rest, or we're short of funds and we need provision, or we're out of desperation looking for patience and don't have any, so we look for perseverance. We run out of time. We need a breakthrough, whatever it is. We get empty and we run to Jesus and we go, I don't know how you're going to help me, but do something. So I think all of us can relate to Mary in this exact situation. She is going to him with a problem, going, I don't know how you're going to fix this, but do something. Solve the problem. And Jesus responds to her with this statement. He goes, woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come. Now, the first time I read that, I went, he's being pretty disrespectful to his mom. But as we dig into this term woman actually isn't harsh. It's more like saying ma'am instead of mom. And what we see here is the reality, especially as Jesus is about to enter into his ministry. As I said, he's begun to call his disciples. He doesn't have all of them yet. But his eyes are now fully fixed on the cross. He knows that he's at the point where the clock is about to start ticking. That he's going to have a period of time to accomplish what God has called him to accomplish before he gets to the cross. He's now entirely focused on moving from his private life now into this very public 3 years of ministry. And so what we see here is that he's distancing himself from his mom. He's removing himself and saying, we can't be as intimate as we used to be as mother and son, because I'm about to go do what God has called me to do. And yet, even with that slight rebuke, because there is still a bit of a rebuke in this statement. Mary still goes to him, or goes to the servants and says, do what he says. Right? She trusts him to find a solution, even if she doesn't know what it is. The text then tells us that there were 6 stone water jars used for purification. These jars were not drinkable water. These would have been jars filled with water just for washing hands and washing dishes. We have 6 of them. It says that there were between 20 and 30 gallons apiece. So that's about 120 to 180 gallons of water. And for those of us that are metric, that's 450 to 680 liters of water. This is a significant portion, and it's important to understand this for a couple of reasons. One is that this shows how many people were at the wedding. If they needed that much water just to wash hands and dishes, there's a lot of people there. The other aspect we see here is it is one of provision. Verse 7 then outlines that Jesus asked them to be filled with water, and the servants obeyed by filling them to the brim. When we read this story, we can't ignore the fact that everything that John writes, because he has this apologetic aspect, he wants to point to Jesus. Every little detail in these miracles is important, and him stating that they were filled to the brim is important. And the reason for that is because what it shows us is that there was no way anybody could have added anything to the mixture to turn it into wine, right? If it's at the brim, you can't add any more, right? So if the servants have filled this full of water and that's it, then there's nothing that anybody could have done, nothing that could have taken away from the story or the proof of the miracle. This is further given to us because Jesus never touches the water. He tells the servants to draw it and take it to the master of the feast. So at no point in time can anybody say, oh, Jesus just did something. He just threw something in there or he mixed it. This is completely miraculous. So not only is the transformation unexplainable other than it being miraculous, the master of the feast then tells the groom, this is the best wine you've served. That's not normal, but this is the best. It's so good that he has to go tell him that this is the best. This is a significant portion as well when you think about it. This is almost 700 liters of the best wine. Right? That's a good party. There's something amazing about this action because for me, what I find incredible is you're going into this situation where Jesus is transitioning from a private life into a public life. And here he performs his very first miracle. And who does he do it for? He does it for his family and his friends. He's about to enter a very public life, and the first thing he does is for those that he cares about. Remember, every miracle for John is a sign. It points to Jesus. It comments on who Jesus is in terms of his character, in terms of who he said he was and what he was doing. And verse 11 summarizes all of this. It says, this, the first of his signs, Jesus did at Cana in Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. It's not hard to imagine why. I mean, they've just seen this incredible miracle. They've seen 680 liters of water turned into the best wine imaginable. And what is their response? Their response is to believe that Jesus is the Messiah. And it begins their journey together for the next 3 years. Right from this very first moment, the disciples recognize who he is. It's one of the reasons why they followed him for 3 years. This first miracle drew them in. But as I said, everything that John highlights is for a purpose, to show who Jesus is. And yet, John makes 2 statements at the end of Jesus' life, at the end of his book, that we cannot ignore, especially in light of this first miracle, especially in light of what we just saw. He performs this miracle. His disciples believe in him. And yet if we move over to John chapter 12, and if you've got your Bibles, you can flip over there. We move over to John chapter 12. We find Jesus has just entered Jerusalem. He's days away from his trial and his crucifixion. His 3-year mission, which started with that miracle of turning water into wine, is now coming to a close. And we pick it up here in verse 37. It says, though he had done so many signs before them, they still did not believe in him. So that the word spoken by the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled. Lord, who has believed what he heard from us? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? Therefore they could not believe, for again Isaiah said, he has blinded their eyes and hardened their heart, lest they see with their eyes and understand with their heart and turn, and I would heal them. Isaiah said these things because he saw his glory and spoke of him. Nevertheless, many even of the authorities believed in him, but for fear of the Pharisees they did not confess it, so that they would not be put out of the synagogue, for they love the glory that comes from man more than the glory that comes from God. Now, in these verses, John outlines that there were those that believed, like we saw in verse 11 of chapter 2, but there were also those that saw the signs and still did not believe in who Jesus was. We then get this last verse where it says that there were those that saw the signs, believed in Jesus, but did not confess. They hesitated. They held back. There was something that prevented them from taking the next step forward and admitting that Jesus was, in fact, who he said he was. Now, why is this important? Well, because the reality is, when we see these signs, when we read the book of John, when we participate in church, we are going to fall into one of those 3 groups. We're going to see the signs and we're going to choose to believe. We're going to hear the stories. We're going to see the amazing teachings and these miracles that we're going to look at over the course of this summer over his 3-year ministry. And we're going to see and realize the profound impact that he has on this world. And we choose to believe that Jesus is who he said he was, the Son of God, come for our salvation. John 1 says it like this. It says, the one who is the true light, that is Jesus, who gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. He came into the very world he created, but the world didn't recognize him. He came to his own people, and even they rejected him. But to all who believed him and accepted him, he gave the right to become children of God. They are reborn, not with a physical birth resulting from human passion or plan, but a birth that comes from God. So the Word became human and made his home among us. He was full of unfailing love and faithfulness, and we have seen his glory, the glory of the Father's one and only Son. John, that's John the Baptist, not John the writer of the book, testified about him when he shouted to the crowds, "This is the one I was talking about when I said, 'Someone is coming after me who is far greater than I, for he existed long before me.' From his abundance we have all received one gracious blessing after another. For the law was given through Moses, that's the old covenant, but God's unfailing love and faithfulness came from Jesus Christ, that is the new." And after all of this, we have a choice of how we are going to respond to these signs. When we're presented with this sign of turning water into wine, how are we going to respond? Are we going to believe? Or is it going to be unbelief? Or is it going to be hesitation? Each of us right now falls into one of those 3 categories. For those of us in the first group, we understand the meaning of the signs. We see the book of John. We see the New Testament. We see the stories of Jesus, and we realize that they point to him as the Son of God. And that for us, the confession of faith leads to salvation. It leads to relationship with him. Just like Mary, he is the one that we turn to in our times of need, our times of desperation, because we know he's the one that will respond, that he's the one that will help. For those of you that fall into this 3rd category, you believe, but you have hesitated. You have not yet confessed that belief. I want to ask you today, why? What is holding you back? What is the fear or the hesitation that is preventing you? You already believe, you just haven't confessed yet. I would encourage you to do that. Take the risk, take the step. It's why we have our yes table. It's over here on my right. We'll open it at the end of the service because hesitation is still a choice. Hesitation is what prevents the difference between unbelief and belief. And I'd encourage you to move past that hesitation. If that means you have questions you need answered, if you need clarification, if you just need somebody to walk you through what it means to confess, then please join us at our yes table and let us help you answer those questions. Don't hesitate any longer. And for those of you that are still in a place of unbelief, you see the signs and you don't know yet what they mean. I want to encourage you as we go through this series, as we look at these signs, as we look at these 7 miracles that John conveys, I want you to see the book for what John actually intended it to be, and that is that it is pointing directly to Jesus Christ. Observe the signs and realize that Jesus was in fact who he said he was. To believe that he came into humanity, that he came for you. And that in that moment when he died on the cross, he created a way for you to be in relationship with him and with the God of the universe, not only today, but for all eternity. Make that step. See the signs. Now, there's one last piece that cannot be missed from this incredible story that John tells us. You see, John foreshadows the last miracle with the first. Through the changing of the water into the wine, he shows us the change from the old covenant to the new. We cannot forget that Jesus ushered in a new covenant. Sacrifice was always required and is required for sin. But no longer are we required to sacrifice the blood of bulls and goats and birds, but instead we have one final sacrifice. Jesus on the cross. And at that point, he established that the old was done, the new is here, and that is what we celebrate. That is what we come into relationship with. We celebrate together. And as our host said, today we're going to celebrate communion. And that really is what communion is all about. We are celebrating the establishment of this new covenant and what that means for each and every one of us. That relationship that we have with God is because of this water into wine, this old into new. And as we take this time, as we sing this song together, as we prepare for communion, I want all of us to think about which of those 3 groups do you belong to. And more than that, if you're in the last 2, if you're in a place of hesitation or unbelief, it's today maybe the day you want to step across what we call the line of faith and move into a place of belief because of seeing the signs that John describes. Now we're going to take a moment here and we're going to sing. And for those of you that aren't familiar with communion, the ushers are going to pass out some emblems. And those emblems, the bread and the cup, represent some very specific aspects of the new covenant. And we'll explain those in a few moments. But the Bible is also very clear in explaining to us that communion is for those that fall into that first group. Communion is for those of us that believe because we recognize what the old to new, what the water into wine, what the bread and the cup represent for each and every one of us. And so today, if you're not yet in that group of belief, it's okay to hold back. It's okay to pass the emblems along and not take one for yourself. The Bible actually says that's what you're supposed to do. So as we take a moment to receive communion here today, let's stand. We're going to join with the team. And then I want you to hold back your elements as we celebrate together after we finish singing together. So let's join with the team.